It was supposed to be just another town hall-style broadcast, civil discussion, moderated debate, and a few polite disagreements. But what unfolded live on national television would go down as one of the most talked-about moments in political media. The panel was set. On the left sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, known for her no-nonsense attitude, sharp mind, and calm under pressure. On the right sat Lieutenant Thomas Granger, a decorated police officer from a mid-sized southern city, invited to speak about law and order. He carried himself with authority, chest puffed, and eyes narrowed behind polished spectacles. The conversation began cordially enough. The moderator introduced the topic of community trust in law enforcement. Jasmine spoke first, highlighting data on accountability measures and stressing the importance of transparency. Her tone was measured, respectful, firm, and backed by facts. But then, just 13 minutes into the program, Granger leaned into his mic with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "With all due respect, Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice laced with condescension, "people like you don't really understand the work we do. You sit in Washington in designer suits, lecturing folks like me who've actually been out there keeping the streets safe." The studio grew tense. Jasmine didn't blink. Her hand remained on the table, steady. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. The moderator looked unsure whether to intervene. And then, slowly, she reached for the mic calmly. Deliberately. Like someone about to dismantle a man with precision. "Lieutenant," she began, her voice cool as glass, "do you have 6 minutes?" The officer shrugged. "Sure." She glanced at the camera. "Good. Because that's all I'll need." The studio lights seemed to dim as all eyes turned toward Jasmine. Even the moderator leaned back, sensing something rare was about to happen, the kind of moment producers pray for but can never plan. Jasmine spoke calmly, each word crisp and undeniable. "First of all, Lieutenant, let's clear something up. I may work in Washington now, but before that, I was a public defender in Texas. I didn't sit in some ivory tower, I sat across from people who had been thrown into the system you claim to protect. I walked into courtrooms where justice was supposed to be blind, and watched it peek through one eye every single day." Granger's smirk began to falter. "I know what it's like to argue for someone who was pulled over because of a broken taillight and ended up spending 2 nights in jail because they couldn't post $300 bail. I've sat with mothers whose sons were booked for resisting, when all they resisted was being treated like they didn't matter." She paused, not for effect, but to let the weight of her words sink in. "And no, Lieutenant, I don't wear a badge. But that doesn't mean I don't know what justice is supposed to look like. Because justice isn't about power. It's about responsibility. And when people entrusted with that power use it to intimidate instead of serve, to escalate instead of protect, that's not bravery. That's betrayal." Granger shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable now. The live chat on the station's feed was exploding with comments. Jasmine leaned slightly forward. "You said I don't understand the work you do. Maybe you're right. Maybe I don't understand the part where a woman calls for help, and ends up in cuffs herself. Maybe I don't understand how a routine stop becomes a funeral. But what I do understand is this: when accountability feels like an attack, it usually means someone's been living without it for too long." There was silence in the studio. Absolute silence. And she wasn't done. Jasmine didn't rush. Her voice remained steady, not loud, not theatrical, just truth, plain and unshakable. She turned slightly toward the audience, as if speaking to every viewer at home who had ever felt ignored, dismissed, or underestimated. "You see, Lieutenant," she continued, "this isn't about you and me. This is about a system that's been allowed to police itself with little to no outside scrutiny. It's about officers who forget that their badge is a symbol of service, not superiority." Granger opened his mouth to respond, but Jasmine held up a single finger, not rudely, just firmly. "You had your turn. Now let me finish." The moderator glanced nervously at the clock, but didn't dare interrupt. Neither did Granger. For years, Jasmine said, communities have begged for reform. They've marched, they've voted, they've organized. Not because they hate law enforcement, but because they want it to be better. Safer. Fairer. You know what would make your job easier? Trust. But trust doesn't come from armored trucks or press conferences. It comes from humility. From listening. From change. Granger looked stiff now, hands clasped tightly in front of him, as if bracing for a storm that had already arrived. And if you think, Jasmine said, turning back to him directly, that speaking over me or throwing around your badge gives you the final word, you've badly misread this moment. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. I don't need a uniform to stand for justice. I carry that responsibility every time I speak into a mic, vote on legislation, or walk into a courtroom. And unlike your authority, mine is earned every single day, in the light, not behind tinted glass. The audience, silent moments before, broke into stunned applause. Granger looked like someone who just realized he brought a paper shield to a steel debate. The moderator, wide-eyed but composed, attempted to regain control of the segment. All right, we're going to, but Jasmine raised her hand gently, without arrogance, and spoke once more, not to Granger now, but to the country. Let me be very clear, she said. This isn't personal. I don't know Lieutenant Granger. I don't know his record. But what I do know is that too many public servants are more interested in defending a broken system than fixing it. And when someone in uniform gets uncomfortable because they're being asked questions, not accused, just questioned, that should raise a red flag for every taxpayer watching this. She turned back to the camera, her tone softening. This conversation matters. Not because it makes good TV, but because somewhere out there, a teenager is watching this. Maybe a girl who wants to be a lawyer. Maybe a boy who wants to be a cop. Maybe someone who's already been pulled over and treated like they don't belong in their own neighborhood. A pause. Just long enough to let the gravity land. We owe them better. Not by yelling louder. Not by flexing credentials. But by showing up with facts, with respect, and with the kind of integrity that doesn't crumble under pressure. Granger now sat in complete silence, visibly shaken, not from being shouted down, but from being outclassed in front of millions. Jasmine finished quietly. I was told this would be a debate. But I came here for a discussion. If anyone else is ready for that, I'm still here. The moderator could only nod. There was no need for a mic drop. She'd just ended his entire narrative, and possibly his career, with truth, restraint, and a 6-minute masterclass in composure. The broadcast cut to commercial shortly after, but by then, the internet had already erupted. Clips of Jasmine's calm dismantling of Lieutenant Granger's remarks were circulating on every major platform, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, even mainstream news outlets. Within the hour, hashtags like #CrockettClarity and #6MinutesOfTruth were trending worldwide. Backstage, Granger sat alone, his posture collapsed, his phone buzzing non-stop, but not with support. Headlines had already started to appear. Officer silenced by Representative Jasmine Crockett in viral showdown. Granger's live TV misstep sparks Department review. Producers approached Jasmine, offering to walk her out discreetly. She politely declined. She moved through the building with the same calm dignity she'd held on stage, shaking hands with staff, thanking the crew, even smiling. A young intern caught up to her near the elevator. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, that was incredible. I didn't know public servants could speak like that." Jasmine looked at her kindly. "That's the problem," she said. "Too many people forget we work for them." Meanwhile, Granger's precinct had gone into damage control mode. The department issued a vague statement about reviewing public appearances by personnel. Internal sources told reporters that leadership wasn't pleased, not with what he said, but with how poorly he represented them. His authority, once ironclad in the community, had cracked, not by scandal, not by force, but by 6 quiet minutes of irrefutable truth. And Jasmine? She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply returned to her office, took off her heels, and got back to work, already preparing her next piece of legislation to ensure that future officers would answer not just to power, but to principle. In the days that followed, Lieutenant Granger was placed on administrative leave, not for violating protocol, but due to what the department called reputational concerns stemming from a televised appearance. It was clear to everyone what that meant. He released a short statement: "I spoke out of turn. I should have shown more respect during the panel. I accept the consequences of my actions and hope to learn from this experience." But it was too late. His authority had eroded, and his credibility, once solid in local circles, was gone. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's office was inundated with emails, letters, and calls. Some came from young law students. Others from retired officers who quietly applauded her poise. One message stood out. It came from a police chief in Michigan: "What you said wasn't anti-police. It was pro-accountability. And we need more of that, from both sides of the badge." Jasmine had been invited to return to the same network a week later. When asked if she'd like to respond to Granger's apology, she simply said, "I accept it. Growth always starts with discomfort." She wasn't interested in humiliation or revenge. She was interested in the truth, in holding people to a higher standard and showing that strength doesn't come from overpowering others, but from standing firm when it matters. And that 6-minute response? It's now required viewing at more than a dozen journalism and law schools across the country, not just as a political moment, but as a masterclass in how to lead under pressure. A few weeks after the broadcast, Jasmine received a handwritten letter, rare in politics, where emails and press releases flood every inbox. The envelope was unmarked, but the signature at the bottom made her pause. It was from Lieutenant Granger. Inside, he wrote, "I was raised to think that authority meant control. I see now that it actually means accountability. Watching that replay, the way you never raised your voice, never took the bait, but still stripped my entire argument bare, it shook me. And maybe that's what I needed. I've started speaking to the younger officers in our department differently now. Less barking, more listening. Maybe that's not redemption. But it's a start." Jasmine folded the letter slowly, setting it beside her notebook. She didn't need his praise, and she hadn't waited for his apology. But still, the letter mattered, not because it excused anything, but because it meant someone had changed. The next day, during a committee hearing, she quoted his letter, without naming him. "When we give people the space to be better, sometimes they surprise you. Real leadership isn't about always being right. It's about being willing to grow." She looked up from her notes. If even one person in uniform is thinking twice before speaking down to someone, then maybe that 6-minute moment did more than end a career. Maybe it began a new conversation. The room fell silent. Again. And just like that, Jasmine Crockett reminded the nation, accountability doesn't end with consequences. Sometimes, it begins with change. The clip of Jasmine's 6-minute response didn't just go viral, it became historic. News outlets dubbed it, the moment that redefined live debate. University professors referenced it in media ethics lectures. Editorials across the country praised Jasmine's composure, not for winning an argument, but for elevating the discourse. She was invited to speak at several law enforcement forums, not to condemn, but to educate. At one such event, she stood before a room full of cadets and said, "You don't have to agree with everything I say. But if your job is to serve the public, then the public has the right to hold you accountable. If you fear questions more than danger, that's not bravery. That's ego." A cadet in the back raised his hand. "Ma'am, how did you stay so calm during that moment?" Jasmine smiled. "Because truth isn't loud. It just doesn't flinch." The room erupted in applause. Meanwhile, cities across the country saw a shift in tone from local departments. Some quietly updated their training guidelines. Others launched civilian review boards. The impact was subtle, but real. And in Granger's former precinct, a new training video was added to the Academy library. Its title? How 6 Minutes Can Change a Culture. Back in Washington, Jasmine Crockett's colleagues took notice, not just of the viral moment, but of what came after. Congressional leadership, both allies and former skeptics, quietly began to shift how they viewed her. One senior representative was overheard saying in a closed-door meeting, "She didn't just defend herself, she elevated the conversation. That's what this chamber needs more of." A few weeks later, Jasmine was asked to co-lead a bipartisan task force on community and law enforcement relations. Some assumed she'd decline, unwilling to work with voices that had long dismissed her. Instead, she accepted. But she set one condition: this task force isn't going to write symbolic reports. We're going to write actual legislation, with timelines, with teeth. Otherwise, I'm not lending it my name. Her approach wasn't fueled by anger, it was powered by precision. She came with case studies, district data, and lived experience. She sat across from sheriffs, attorneys general, and fellow lawmakers who had once underestimated her. None of them did anymore. Even seasoned legislators, used to dodging tough issues, started falling in line, because Jasmine didn't shout over people. She gave them no choice but to listen. And for the first time in years, reform didn't just seem possible, it felt inevitable. Months later, in a packed Capitol hearing room, Jasmine Crockett sat before cameras once again, but this time, not as a guest or panelist. She was chairing the first public session of the National Accountability and Community Trust Initiative, a bipartisan framework she had co-authored. The committee included police chiefs, legal scholars, civil rights leaders, and even a few of Jasmine's former critics. She opened the session with just one sentence: "This isn't about blame, it's about building something better." Reporters in the back scribbled notes, but everyone knew this wasn't just politics. This was change, live and in motion. Outside the chamber, protesters and supporters gathered together, not in opposition, but in hope. Signs didn't read, "Shut it down," or "No justice, no peace." They read, "6 minutes changed everything. Lead like Jasmine. Courage is quiet, truth is loud." And somewhere in that crowd stood a quiet figure in plain clothes, former Lieutenant Thomas Granger. He wasn't there to be seen. He stood at the back, arms folded, watching the ripple he never meant to cause. A younger officer stood beside him and asked, "Is that her?" Granger nodded. "Yeah," he said softly. "That's her." The hearing ended to thunderous applause, and Jasmine stepped out to greet the press, but paused when she saw Granger. They exchanged a glance. No bitterness. No words. Just a nod. It was never about destroying someone. It was about demanding better, and showing the world what real leadership looks like. And Jasmine Crockett did it not by shouting, not by storming out, and not by seeking revenge. She did it in 6 unforgettable minutes, and the country never looked at accountability the same way again.